The snow had already stopped when I saw the boot prints, one set straight across the rear patio. No return path, just 5 clean impressions leading from the double doors of room 6 into the trees. That part of the lodge backed up to thick pine, and nobody used that exit in winter unless they were smoking or sneaking off for something. But the prints were fresh, still sharp at the edges. I followed them with my eyes until the white swallowed them whole. Let me know where you're listening from tonight, and if you've ever stayed somewhere that just didn't feel right. And if these stories keep you company, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. I'm Dana Ellis. I was 37 the winter this happened, working as the assistant manager at a mountain lodge about 2 hours west of Denver. The place wasn't fancy. We had 12 guest rooms, 1 working fireplace, and a front desk system, still running on Windows XP. But the tourists liked it because it was quiet, couples mostly. Sometimes retirees who just wanted to sit in the snow with a book and a pot of tea. This happened in February, our slowest month. We'd had 2 cancellations that week because of the weather, and most of the staff had gone home early. The snowstorm had started that afternoon, slow at first, then hard and sideways, like it always does up in the pass. By 6, the power had blinked twice. By 8, only 1 guest hadn't checked in yet. His reservation just said "R. Hale," no phone number, paid in full online. I didn't think much of it at the time. We got a lot of those one-night winter guests, usually folks driving cross-country who hit the storm and needed to pull off somewhere. What stuck with me, even before everything else, was how silent he was. Not rude, not strange, just too quiet. No greeting, no questions. Just handed me his ID and stood there while I scanned it. His coat was wet, dark green canvas, with a strange smudge across the chest, like dried salt or ash. I offered him a mug of coffee from the carafe by the fireplace, and he just gave a small shake of the head. Room 6 was at the end of the lower hall next to the ice machine. I gave him his key card and pointed the way. He nodded once, then turned and walked down the hall without a word. That would have been the end of it. I might have forgotten him entirely if it weren't for what happened later. I stayed on a bit later that night because Len Turner, our maintenance guy, was doing a final walk of the property. It was part of our closing routine when the guest count was low. Make sure none of the pipes had frozen. The boiler was still ticking along. No raccoons had gotten into the dumpster again. I made myself a second cup of coffee and watched the snow stack higher against the front steps. Around 10:30, the lights flickered once more. Just for a second. I got up to check the breaker panel in the office, and that's when Len came back in through the service door. He looked a little thrown off. "You see the guy in 6 yet?" he asked. I said, "Yeah, he'd checked in about 2 hours ago." Len scratched his beard, wet snow still clinging to the shoulders of his coat. "He's just sitting in there. No lights on, window wide open. Doesn't even look at me." I frowned. "You went in, door was cracked. I was checking the heating ducts. The fan in that wing's been making a racket." Now Len wasn't the type to spook easy. He'd worked at ski lodges all over Colorado before settling here. He used to joke that he'd seen more snowed-in weirdos than he had working furnaces. But that night, something in his voice had changed. He wasn't doing anything Len said, just sitting on the edge of the bed, coat still on. No bag, not watching TV, not looking at his phone, just staring at the floor. We stood there a moment, both unsure of whether to make more of it or just let it go. I said maybe the guy was tired. maybe had a long drive. Len didn't argue, but I could tell it sat wrong with him. By midnight, I was finishing my last round of emails and packing up to head out when I realized room 6 still hadn't logged onto the Wi-Fi. Normally, that wouldn't matter, but we had a system that flagged unconnected devices after a certain amount of time, mostly for security. Out of habit, I pulled up the room activity. No TV usage, no light controls, no heat adjustment, nothing since check-in. I stared at the screen for a few seconds. It wasn't unheard of, especially for older guests who preferred to unplug, but something about that silence made me pause. Out the front windows, the snowfall had slowed, just a fine powder now dusting over what the storm had already buried. I thought about going down the hall and knocking, but I didn't want to seem intrusive. Instead, I sent a courtesy message to the room through our system. Let us know if you need anything. Snow should clear by morning. The little status bar blinked green to show it delivered. No reply. The next morning, I was the first one in. Len showed up a little after 7 with his usual thermos of black coffee and a half-frozen breakfast burrito he nuked in the break room microwave. We did a walk together since the overnight systems hadn't flagged anything else. But when we got to room 6, everything felt off. The Do Not Disturb sign was still hanging on the knob, but the door wasn't fully closed. Not open enough to call it ajar, just not latched. Len gave it a soft push, and it opened with a slow creak. Inside, the curtains were pulled tight, lights off, bed untouched. The little card with the Wi-Fi info still sitting on the desk where I'd left it. But the window, the one Len had mentioned the night before, was open again. Snow had drifted in along the sill and dampened the carpet. There were no bags, no food wrappers, no signs that anyone had stayed the night. Except the boots. A pair of heavy snow boots sat on the floor near the foot of the bed, facing the door. Len crossed the room and leaned out the open window. Footprints, he said after a beat. Just one set, heading out toward the ridge, none coming back. We radioed the ranger station and filed a report, but no one fitting his description turned up missing. The name on the reservation didn't lead anywhere. The ID he'd handed me turned out to be fake. The photo was real, but the rest belonged to someone who'd died 6 years ago in Idaho. We checked the security footage. There he was, walking in at 8:12 p.m., hood up, face down, hands in pockets. But the angle facing room 6's hallway had cut out for maintenance weeks earlier. And the back patio camera snow-covered lens, nothing but static. That was almost 20 years ago. Every now and then, someone mentions a guest who seems off, or a noise at the far end of the hall in the middle of the night. We always check room 6 first. Sometimes the window's open. Always just a crack, and no one ever sees who did it. I've driven all kinds of people at night. The drunk, the stranded, the angry, the silent. You learn to read moods fast in this job, especially on the graveyard shift. But there was something about this one guy, something that stayed with me long after he got out of the car. I was working nights in Kansas City back then. My schedule ran from 6 p.m. to about 4 in the morning, mostly near the industrial district where factory workers and warehouse crews needed rides after late shifts. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid better than you'd think. Most nights were quiet. I kept to myself, kept the radio low, and drove whoever needed driving. That night in late October had started like any other drizzly, cold streetlights, turning everything a dull yellow. I remember it was around 2:15 a.m. when the dispatch chirped in. A pickup request near an old distribution center just off Truman Road. Not a common location at that hour, but not unheard of either. The place used to run 3 shifts, and every so often you'd get a straggler coming out late after loading trucks. When I pulled up, there wasn't a soul in sight. No workers, no night security. Just that big aluminum siding building with its windows boarded over and a couple of blinking floodlights that made more shadow than they did light. I waited a minute, then 2. I was about to cancel the ride when I saw a figure emerge from the edge of the alley, tall, wearing a dark, hooded coat, moving slow, but with purpose. He didn't wave or say anything, just walked straight to the back passenger door and got in without hesitation. He didn't give me a name, didn't ask where I was headed, just said, "North. I'll tell you where to stop." His voice was calm, no accent I could place, and quiet in that way that makes you lean in without realizing it. I glanced in the rear-view mirror. He didn't meet my eyes. He was staring out the window like he was watching something I couldn't see. I pulled away, heading toward the north side, keeping my eyes on the road, but my ears tuned to the silence behind me. I don't mind quiet passengers, actually prefer them, but this wasn't ordinary quiet. It was more like the kind you find in hospital waiting rooms at 3 in the morning. Thick, tense, like it's covering something. About 10 minutes in, I tried making small talk. Just something simple. "You heading home from work?" He didn't respond at first. Then just as I was about to let it go, he said, "I used to work near here, not anymore." His tone wasn't angry, more resigned, like someone talking about an old injury that still flared up when it rained. As we got further from downtown, I realized we weren't headed anywhere specific. Every time we reached a crossroad, he'd point left or right, no street names, no addresses, just gestures. And every turn brought us into emptier parts of town. Rows of dark buildings, closed gas stations, empty intersections, where the only movement was the blinking red of old traffic signals. Eventually, we ended up in an area I didn't recognize. No homes, no shops, just warehouses, chain-link fences, and a long stretch of cracked pavement leading under an overpass. I slowed the car and asked again, "You sure this is where you want to be?" That's when he finally looked at me through the rear view. His eyes weren't angry or strange, just heavy, like he was carrying something far too big for one man. He said, "Pull into that lot up ahead, by the gas station." The gas station looked abandoned, but the lights were on. One of those all-night places that only stays open because it's too dangerous to close. I pulled into the lot, and the man sat there for a few seconds before speaking again. "I need to make a stop. Don't leave. I'll be right back." He stepped out of the car and walked toward the building. Not rushed, not cautious, just steady like this was something he'd done 100 times. The store looked empty inside, no customers, no noise, but the door opened automatically when he approached, and I saw him disappear behind the glass. I waited. First minute, then 2, then 5. I was starting to feel uneasy. Not scared exactly, but there was something about the way the street light flickered over the parking lot that made everything feel too still. I looked at the building. No movement, no sign of him. Then I saw the clerk. She appeared suddenly middle-aged hair, tied back, wearing a loose red jacket that didn't match the uniform. She was standing behind the counter, staring straight out through the glass. Not looking at me, just staring like she was trying to make sense of something. I rolled down my window, caught her eye, and gave a little wave. She didn't react, just turned and disappeared into the back room. 10 more minutes passed, no sign of the man. I stepped out of the car and walked to the door. It was locked. I knocked. No answer. The lights were still on, and I could see part of the counter through the window. The clerk wasn't there anymore. I walked back to the car, trying to decide whether to call it in or just drive off and forget the whole thing. That's when I saw it. The back passenger door where the man had been sitting, it was open, just slightly, like someone had exited without fully shutting it. I was sure I'd heard it click when he got out earlier. I always listen for that sound. I checked the back seat. Empty. No belongings. No signs of anyone ever sitting there. But the seatbelt was pulled all the way out like it had been used and never retracted. That detail made my chest tighten a bit. I circled the car once, then went back to the station. Still locked. Still no movement inside. Finally, I called non-emergency dispatch to report a suspicious stop. They said they'd send someone to check it out. I stuck around another 10 minutes before a cruiser pulled up, lights off, and 2 officers stepped out. I explained what happened. They asked if the passenger gave a name, showed ID, paid in cash or card. I told them he hadn't paid yet, that he said he'd be right back. They looked at each other, then at the store. One officer tried the door. Still locked. The other walked around back. Eventually, the one from the rear came back, shaking his head. No signs of anyone. They said they'd follow up and asked me to leave my contact info. I offered to show them the dash cam footage, and they said someone from investigations would reach out the next day. But no one ever did. 2 days later, out of curiosity more than anything, I drove back to that part of town. The gas station was boarded up, graffiti on the side, windows covered in plywood. I asked a guy sweeping the sidewalk across the street if the place had shut down recently. He looked at me and said, "That station's been closed for months. Clerk moved back to Iowa after her husband died." I didn't argue, just nodded and got back in the car. I keep that night to myself most of the time. Nothing happened, not exactly. But every now and then I'll pick up a passenger who doesn't say much, who sits a little too still, who asks to be taken somewhere that doesn't feel like it should exist anymore. And every time I check the rear view, I make sure they're still there. I used to love sleeping with the windows open. That soft ocean breeze coming through the screen used to calm me better than any sleep app or melatonin ever could. But not after that week. Not after the night I heard the closet door creak and knew I hadn't left it open. It was the spring of 2022, and I'd booked a month-long Airbnb in a quiet town along the South Carolina coast. I'd just wrapped up a big freelance project and wanted some time to reset somewhere quiet, away from deadlines and screen fatigue. The place was just a few blocks from the beach, tucked back in a residential neighborhood with sand-streaked sidewalks and wind-battered mailboxes. Most of the homes on the street were vacation rentals, but the one I stayed in was different. It belonged to a woman named Miss Ruth, who still lived on the property in a smaller unit above the garage. The listing said classic cottage with vintage charm, which was code for older home, a little drafty, but clean and comfortable. It had hardwood floors that creaked in places, and those louvered closet doors that never quite close unless you lean into them. The kind with slats you can see through if the lighting is just right. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just happy to be somewhere warm with a breeze and the sound of gulls instead of honking horns and client emails. Miss Ruth was kind, polite in that old school way that made you feel like you'd stepped back a few decades. She wore those wide cardigans that drape past the hips and always had something cooking that smelled like soup or stewed tomatoes. We only spoke in passing. She'd wave from her balcony, ask how I was sleeping, remind me that the lock on the back gate sticks sometimes. I liked her, but I didn't ask questions. She seemed like someone who'd been there forever and didn't plan on leaving. The first few nights were normal. I walked to the beach each morning, worked from the little breakfast nook in the afternoon, and took hot showers in the old clawfoot tub that made the pipes groan like they were waking up from hibernation. The bed was firm, the linens smelled faintly of lavender, and I slept well, except for the occasional creak of the house settling or a distant dog barking down the block. But by the end of the first week, I started to notice little things that didn't make sense. It started with the window screen in the bathroom. I always kept it latched from the inside, mostly to keep the bugs out. But one morning I noticed it had popped loose at the bottom corner, just enough to catch the breeze and make a soft tapping sound against the frame. I chalked it up to old hardware and clipped it back into place. 2 days later, I found one of my socks, just one sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor. It was dry clean, but I knew I hadn't left it there. I live alone. I don't drop clothing around. I told myself it must have stuck to something when I pulled laundry out of the dryer and fallen without me noticing. But the feeling lingered. The closet door in the bedroom had started to drift open at night. I'd shut it before getting into bed, tightly, the way you do in older houses that don't always sit level. But I'd wake up in the morning and find it ajar. Not wide open, just a few inches. Just enough for someone to peek through if they were standing inside. Around this time, I started keeping a knife in the drawer by the bed. Just a small one, the kind you'd use for camping. I wasn't scared exactly, but I wasn't at ease either. That feeling you get when something's off, but there's no proof, nothing you could explain to someone else without sounding silly. Then one night, probably around 1 or 2 in the morning, I heard a soft bump. Not a loud noise, just a single thump, like someone had gently bumped into a door or brushed past a piece of furniture. I froze. I'd been half asleep, that fuzzy edge between dreaming and waking, and it pulled me fully into the present. I listened. Nothing. The hallway was dark. The little nightlight I'd plugged into the bathroom cast a soft glow, just enough to make out shapes. I stared at the closet. The slatted door stood still, closed. Or almost. I reached for my phone and turned on the flashlight. The closet door had a small vertical gap, a few inches, and through that gap I saw something I can't explain away. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't clothes hanging inside. It was the shape of a hand. Pale fingers. Still. Resting against the doorframe from the inside. I sat up so fast the bed creaked beneath me. My heart was hammering so loud I thought it might drown out the sound of whatever else was in that room. I didn't speak, didn't call out. I just kept the light pointed at the door and reached with my other hand toward the nightstand drawer. But before I could get it open, the door moved. Not fast, just a soft glide. It opened halfway, then stopped. Nothing came out. No one ran. No sound. The room was dead quiet again. I stood up slowly, holding the flashlight in front of me like a weapon, and walked toward the door. Every step felt like it took a minute. When I got there, I grabbed the edge of the door and yanked it open all the way. There was nothing inside, just clothes, shoes, and an old quilt I'd never touched. The air inside smelled stale and faintly of dust. I closed the door. This time I wedged a chair in front of it. Then I turned every light in the house on and sat on the couch until the sun came up. That morning I walked to the gas station at the edge of the neighborhood, the only place open at 6 a.m., and bought a coffee I didn't need just to clear my head. The man behind the counter was friendly, middle-aged local, the kind who's worked the same shift for years and knows everyone by name. He asked where I was staying, and I told him. When I mentioned Miss Ruth's cottage, something in his face changed. Not alarm, not surprise, just recognition. "She's still renting that place out?" he asked. I nodded. He looked down, then said, "Be careful. There's been break-ins around that part of town." I asked if he meant recently. He didn't answer right away, just said, "If anything ever seems off, let Ruth know. She usually keeps an eye out." That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the kitchen with the light on and my phone in hand, debating whether to pack up and leave. Around 1:30 a.m., I heard footsteps above me, light, steady ones moving from one side of the ceiling to the other. Miss Ruth's unit was directly above, so I assumed it was her. Maybe she was checking on something. Maybe she heard it too. The next morning, I saw her in the driveway. I asked if she'd been up late. She smiled and said no, she'd turned in early. Her ankles had been acting up again, she said. She hadn't come downstairs in 2 days. She told me that while stirring a glass of tea with lemon, like she didn't hear what she'd just said. I left that afternoon. I didn't finish my booking, didn't ask for a refund. I packed my things and drove 6 hours to my sister's house without stopping once. I don't use Airbnbs anymore. I still check closet doors every single night. And sometimes I wonder, if I'd opened that door a second later, would someone have still been standing there? Or were they already moving toward the bed? We were just killing time, really. That's all it ever was. That weird stretch between sunset and curfew when you're 18 and nothing ever feels serious, not even the stuff that should. It was the last night of the state fair, early September 2007. One of those late summer evenings where the sky still glowed orange at 8:15 and the smell of grease and sugar hung thick in the air. I'd gone with 2 friends, Charlie and Denny, both of whom had cars before I did, and always seemed to know where the fun was. We weren't there for the rides, or even the food, really. Mostly just to watch people flirt with strangers, maybe sneak off and find a quiet spot to drink warm beer from someone's trunk. The fairgrounds were flat and dusty, bordered by chain-link fencing and long rows of parked trucks. There were lights everywhere, flashing bulbs around booths, floodlights near the barns, and the slow, pulsing spin of the Ferris wheel at the far end of the lot. I remember the texture of it all, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the stickiness of spilled soda on picnic tables, the sound of generators humming behind the game trailers. We weren't causing trouble, but we weren't behaving either. just wandering. That's when we saw the photo booth. It was tucked between a pretzel stand and one of those knock-off caricature stalls. A little white box with red curtains and a laminated sign that said, 4 poses, $3. One of those booths that had probably been there longer than most of the vendors, the kind that prints real photo strips, not digital, not glossy, just ink on matte paper with a timestamp in the corner. Charlie joked that we should all cram in and make stupid faces. Denny said no way, that it smelled like feet. I said I'd go in solo and use it to flirt if I had to. Dumb stuff. Teen stuff. We were just about to walk past it when we noticed someone already inside. The curtain was drawn. From the little crack where it didn't quite close, I could see a shape. A girl maybe 17 or 18 sitting perfectly still. No movement. Just waiting. The screen flashed once, then again. I don't know why, but we stopped and watched. When the curtain finally moved, the girl stepped out slowly. She didn't look at us, didn't smile. Just turned and walked straight past like we weren't there. Her clothes looked vintage, almost like she was in costume. Long denim skirt, faded floral top, canvas shoes. Her hair was dark and straight, cut blunt across her shoulders. There was something off about her expression, blank, maybe, too calm. No phone, no bag, no fair food in hand. Just the strip of photos she tucked into her back pocket as she disappeared into the crowd. Charlie said something like, "Well, that was weird," and we laughed it off. But then we looked back at the booth and realized something stranger. It was still lit up, still printing. A second photo strip came out even though no one else had gone in. Denny stepped forward and grabbed it before it hit the tray. He looked at it for a second, then handed it to me. There were 4 frames. The first showed the girl, sitting still, hands in her lap. The second, she was glancing over her shoulder like someone had just called her name. The third frame was blurry like the camera had jolted, and her face was slightly turned, almost fearful. In the last photo, she was gone. Just an empty booth curtain half open, with what looked like a man's shoe barely visible at the edge of the frame. We stood there a long time. Charlie kept saying it had to be a trick, a leftover from a previous session or some kind of promotional thing, but I could feel it in my stomach the way you feel static before a storm. This wasn't leftover. It was printing live, and she hadn't stayed long enough for a second set. We argued about what to do. Denny wanted to throw the photo away, but I kept it. I don't know why. Maybe because I didn't want it ending up in someone else's hands. Maybe because part of me needed to believe it was just a glitch. We left the fair about an hour later. It was dark by then, and the parking lot was thinning out. As we were walking to Charlie's truck, we saw the girl again. She was standing by the outer fence near the loading area where the trailers were starting to pack up. Just standing there. Same clothes, same stillness. She was staring at a small utility shed behind the main lot, not moving, not blinking. When we called out just something casual like, "You good?" She didn't react, didn't even flinch. Then someone stepped out of the shed. A man, early 40s maybe, wearing fairgrounds staff coveralls. He looked at her, then looked at us. And then he walked the opposite direction fast. We drove home without saying much. The next morning I looked up the fairgrounds on the county website. There was a section about incidents and lost items. I clicked through a few years, just curious. In 1994, a girl named Ava Donnelly had gone missing from that same fair. last seen leaving a photo booth near the East Pavilion. No suspect, no leads. Her photo was still listed teenage, long dark hair, floral top. I stared at it for a long time. It was her. The girl we saw. The girl who never blinked. I went to the police station that week with the photo strip in my jacket pocket. Officer Delgado took my statement, asked the usual questions. I told him everything, where we were, what we saw, how she acted. When I pulled the strip out and slid it across the desk, he didn't pick it up right away, just stared at it. Then he asked if we still had the original, not a copy. I said yes. He told me something strange. Over the years, that booth had been removed and relocated 3 times. But every time it came back to the fairgrounds, someone would report seeing a girl who didn't belong. A girl who matched Ava's description. A girl who left photos behind that no one remembered taking. They never found the man from the shed. They never reopened the case. I still have the photo strip. The last frame where she's gone and something else is stepping in has started to fade. But the timestamp at the bottom is still clear. I used to think traveling alone would help me reset, give me space to clear my head, figure some things out. But now I know better. Some places aren't meant to be experienced alone. It was spring of 2022 when I took a last-minute trip down to the South Carolina coast. I'd been freelancing full-time for over a year at that point, mostly design work for small businesses, restaurant menus, real estate flyers, anything that paid on time. My apartment in Charlotte felt like a shoebox by then. I just needed a change of scenery and something quieter than traffic and upstairs neighbors. So I booked a week in a beachside Airbnb outside a town called St. Elora, a name I'd never heard before, and couldn't find much about online other than a few archived newspaper blurbs and a sparse town Facebook page. The listing looked normal enough, a quaint single-story cottage with faded blue shutters and a little porch swing facing the ocean. It had 4 stars, a handful of reviews, and most importantly, was available for cheap during a gap week in April. The host, someone named Miss Ruth, messaged me back quickly, thanking me for choosing her property and reminding me to check in before dark so the keypad wouldn't act up. I chalked it up to Southern hospitality and bad Wi-Fi. The place was smaller than it looked in the photos, but cozy. Pine floorboards, mismatched furniture, a faint smell of lemon cleaner that lingered in the air. The porch faced a narrow dune path leading to the beach, and the only real noise came from cicadas and the occasional gull. There was no TV, but there was a record player and a few old books about shipwrecks and lighthouse folklore. I spent the first 2 nights watching the tides roll in, sketching from the deck and sleeping with the windows cracked to hear the waves. It was peaceful. Until the 3rd night. I'd just come in from a walk, maybe 9:30 p.m., and noticed something odd when I passed the hallway. There was a door at the end that hadn't been there before. That sounds dramatic, I know. But I had walked that hallway every day, once to store my suitcase in the guest room, once to get extra towels, and I was certain there were only 2 doors, one to the bathroom, one to the 2nd bedroom. This 3rd door was directly at the end of the hall, where I distinctly remembered a bookshelf built into the wall. The door was plain, no knob, just an old keyhole and a dull brass plate about shoulder height. Something about it gave me a chill, the kind you get when a sound doesn't match the room or a photo looks subtly wrong. I walked down the hallway, slowly reached out and tapped the door with the side of my hand. It made a hollow sound. I tried pushing it, but it didn't budge. No click, no resistance. Just still. I stood there a long time trying to remember if maybe I'd missed it somehow. Maybe the bookshelf was in a different hallway, or maybe I'd been too distracted to notice the door. But that didn't sit right, so I did something I normally wouldn't do. I messaged the host. "Hey, Miss Ruth," I typed quick question. "Is that back hallway supposed to have a door at the end? Just want to make sure I'm not imagining things." She didn't respond right away. I left my phone charging on the kitchen counter and tried to forget about it. Maybe it was locked storage or a utility room. Nothing unusual. But around midnight, I checked my phone again. There was a response. "Just ignore it, hon. Not for guests." That was it. No smiley face, no apology for the confusion. Just those 6 words sent at 12:02 a.m. The next day, I stopped at a gas station a few miles inland, mostly for snacks, but also because I wanted to talk to someone. The woman behind the counter looked to be in her 60s, with sun-leathered skin and tired eyes. I mentioned I was staying near the dunes at a place run by someone named Ruth. Her face changed. "You mean Miss Ruth's old place?" she said. "She passed in '09. Stroke. Her daughter runs the rentals now, I think, but she don't come around much." I didn't say anything right away. I just nodded and thanked her and bought a pack of crackers I didn't want. My phone had said Miss Ruth, not Rachel or property management. And the message, it was signed off as though it came from her directly. That night I checked the Airbnb listing again. It had changed. Same house, same pictures, but the hallway shots were gone. The reviews were all from over a year ago, and none mentioned anything unusual. No door, no strange sounds, no names, just vague sentences like quiet place or odd smell, but fine for a short stay. I decided I'd sleep in the living room that night, couch cushions and throw blanket facing the sliding glass doors that looked out over the dunes. Around 3:30 a.m., I woke up without knowing why. Not from a sound exactly, more like a change in pressure, the way your ears pop in a car going downhill. When I turned my head, I saw movement in the hallway mirror. Someone was standing in the dark, backlit faintly by moonlight through the bathroom window. I couldn't make out a face, but the shape was tall, still, and angled toward the door that wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud enough to fog the glass near my face. Just watched. After maybe a full minute, the figure turned, not fast, not slow, and stepped through the door. Not opened it, not unlocked it. Just stepped through like the door wasn't a barrier at all. Then the hallway went completely dark again. At dawn, I packed my things without showering. Drove to Charleston and booked a chain hotel near the airport, even though my trip had 2 nights left. I didn't message the host again. I didn't report anything. I just left a 1-star review with no text. A few days later, the listing was gone. But the thing that still gets me, the part that settles like weight behind my ribs every time I try to sleep, is this. When I got home and transferred my vacation photos from my phone to my laptop, there was one picture I don't remember taking. It was of the hallway. The 3rd door was wide open, and inside, barely visible through the blur of motion, was the same figure turned just slightly toward the camera, looking out. I still have the photo strip. It's yellowed at the edges, now curled from years in a drawer I rarely open. But that last frame, that fifth one that shouldn't be there, still looks exactly the same. Back in 2007, I was finishing up high school in a farm town outside Wichita. Nothing much ever happened that far out. Just dusty roads, Friday night football, and cornfields that buzzed at night. That spring, a traveling carnival set up at the county fairgrounds, rides, booths, cheap prizes, the works. They did it every few years whenever the town council scraped together enough for a permit. I went with Charlie and Denny, two guys I'd known since grade school. Charlie had a fake ID and a car with a busted taillight. Denny had a laugh that always seemed about 2 seconds ahead of the joke. The three of us spent most of that Friday night wandering the fair in a kind of sleep-deprived teenage trance, funnel cakes, a few weak rides, and that warped, tinny music playing over every speaker. What I remember most is the way everything felt off. Not scary exactly, but off. Like the booths were too close together. Like the air smelled more like gasoline than fried food. And like everyone working there had the same look in their eyes, too wide, too tired, too polite. It was almost 10:30 when we came across the old photo booth. It was wedged between a rusted popcorn stand and a row of locked porta-johns, half lit by one flickering bulb. 3 shots for $2 was painted above the entrance in crooked red letters, even though the coin slot clearly took quarters. I remember Denny laughing when he noticed it. 3 shots, he said. Sounds more like a vaccine than a photo. There was a girl standing beside the booth, maybe a few years older than us, dark hoodie arms crossed, chewing on her thumbnail. She looked like she'd been waiting for someone who never showed up. Charlie, of course, saw this as an opportunity. He walked over, struck up some awkward joke, and within a minute they were squeezed into the booth together. Denny and I stayed outside, watching the red light above the door flicker as the photos printed. It was an old-style strip 4 square black and white frames, printed on thin, glossy paper. When Charlie came out, he looked pale, like genuinely pale. Not embarrassed, not blushing, just sort of drained. He didn't say much, just showed us the photo. The first 2 frames were normal. Him and the girl, Ava, she said her name, was smiling, half laughing. A little awkward. The third one, Charlie was turned away from the camera, looking off to the side. Ava wasn't looking at him. She was staring dead into the lens, completely still. And the fourth one, the last one that should have printed, showed only Charlie. Ava was gone. Not moved, not blurred, just gone. It didn't make sense. The time between shots was maybe 2 seconds. There was no way she could have left the booth without us seeing, and we'd been standing right there. Charlie swore she hadn't moved. He said he hadn't even heard the door open. He just blinked and she wasn't sitting next to him anymore. We turned around to ask her what the hell had happened, but she was gone. We checked around, the corner near the popcorn stand, even jogged past the ride entrances. Nothing. The whole fairground felt emptier than it should have. Charlie didn't want to talk about it. He folded the strip up and shoved it into his jacket pocket. We left about 10 minutes later. The next morning, he texted me a picture of the strip. "Tell me this wasn't there last night," he wrote. There was a 5th frame, identical in size and shape, but this one was darker, grainier. Charlie wasn't in it. Neither was Ava. Just a clown. Not cartoonish or circus bright. This one had heavy black makeup under its eyes and a wide, colorless mouth that didn't look painted on. It looked wrong. like it had been smiling for too long. The background looked like the inside of the booth, but the angle was different, like the shot was taken from inside the wall, like the camera was watching from behind. Charlie swore it hadn't been there before. We drove back to the fairgrounds that afternoon, but the booth was gone. Not just closed, physically gone. The popcorn stand and porta-johns were still there, but the space between them was empty. We asked one of the carnival workers, a heavy-set guy with a faded staff shirt and sunburned neck, if he knew anything about a photo booth being moved. He just looked at us and said, "We haven't had one of those in years." That was all he'd say. 2 days later, Charlie stopped showing up to school. His mom told the principal he was sick, but nobody could get him on the phone. Denny and I drove by his house, knocked, waited, left messages. Nothing. On the third day, Denny and I went back to the fairgrounds at night. We didn't tell anyone. We just wanted to prove we hadn't imagined it. The carnival was still there, but smaller now. Half the booths were dark. The music had stopped. We walked the perimeter looking for any sign of Ava or the booth, or something we could explain to someone, without sounding crazy. Instead, we found a pile of old equipment near the back fence, metal scaffolding tarp, and what looked like the broken side panel of a photo booth. We could barely make out the red letters. 3 shots for $2. There were deep scratches all over the surface, and in the dust nearby, someone had drawn a single shape of face, with hollow eyes and a too wide grin. We went to the police the next morning, told Officer Delgado everything, or at least the parts we could say out loud without being laughed out of the building. He listened, not kindly, but not dismissively either. When we showed him the photo, his expression changed. He said something quiet to himself and stepped out for a moment. When he came back, he asked to keep the strip, said he'd log it, though I never saw it again. Charlie never came back to school. His family moved 3 months later. I still check for his name online sometimes. Nothing ever comes up. And that 5th frame, the one with the clown, I scanned it years later and brightened the image. In the bottom right corner behind the clown's shoulder, barely visible in the grain, was Ava's face, turned toward the camera, still smiling. I used to drive long stretches of highway in Nevada for work, and even though I wasn't a trucker, I kept the same hours. It was easier to work through the night when the heat dropped and the desert lay silent under the moon. That particular summer in 2021, I was headed back from a breakdown call near Tonopah. The road between there and Goldfield runs flat and lonely for miles, with hardly any lights except the stars and the occasional glow of a gas station. It was close to 3 in the morning when I noticed a car pulled halfway into the sand shoulder hazards, clicking faintly in the dark. I slowed, thinking I'd see a stranded driver. Instead, I saw 2 men standing in front of the car, their faces turned toward me. They weren't waving for help, just watching, as if they'd been waiting for me to arrive. I pulled over anyway because that's what you do on that stretch of road. Folks break down out there all the time. I stepped out and asked if they needed a hand. The taller one nodded but didn't move, while the other bent slightly at the waist like he was squinting at me. Their car was dusty, no license plate on the back, and the trunk sat open with nothing inside. Something about the silence made my skin crawl. Usually, stranded drivers explain themselves right away, tell you what went wrong, how long they'd been stuck. These 2 said almost nothing. The taller one finally asked if I could give them a ride to Goldfield. His voice was too calm, like he was repeating a line he'd rehearsed. I agreed mostly because it felt safer to keep things moving than to stand there staring at them. They climbed into the back of my truck, both sitting too close together, even though the seat stretched wide. I pulled back onto the highway, keeping my eyes on the road, though I could see their reflections faintly in the rearview mirror. Neither man looked tired or relieved. They looked alert, unblinking, like they'd been riding all night. 10 minutes later, the taller one leaned forward and asked what channel my radio was set to. Not the FM, dial the dispatch scanner I used for roadside calls. His question froze me. Only mechanics, cops, and tow drivers ever cared about that. I told him it was just standard nothing interesting. He sat back without another word. That's when I noticed the fuel gauge on my dash drop suddenly, as if someone had siphoned a quarter tank in an instant. I tapped the glass, thinking it was faulty, but the needle stayed low. I glanced in the mirror and saw the shorter man grinning faintly, his teeth just visible in the passing starlight. The road into Goldfield narrows to a 2-lane stretch lined with abandoned buildings. I figured if I could make it into town, I'd find anyone to help me. But as we rolled past the first boarded-up storefronts, the taller man tapped my shoulder. "Stop here," he said. "Not at a gas station, not at a house with lights on, just a cracked corner lot with an old sign too faded to read." I told him I'd take them farther in, but he repeated the order with a sharper edge. My gut told me not to argue. I pulled over. Both men slid out, moving in sync. Before shutting the door, the taller one leaned down and said, "You didn't see us." Then they crossed the lot, disappearing between the broken buildings without a sound. I sat there for a long minute, heart pounding, trying to make sense of it. Then I called dispatch, told them I'd picked up 2 suspicious passengers and dropped them in Goldfield. The operator went quiet, then told me to stay put. 15 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up. The officer who stepped out looked worn and serious. He asked me to describe the men, then sighed in a way that made my stomach drop. He said they'd been looking for a stolen vehicle earlier that night, same make, same color. It had vanished off the road about 20 miles north along with the men who'd been driving it. No license plates, trunk stripped clean. When I asked if they'd been found before, the officer just looked at me and said, "We get calls like this every couple years. Same stretch of road, same description. Nothing ever comes of it." I drove home after that, the fuel gauge slowly creeping back to normal, as if it had never moved. I don't know if I gave 2 wanted men a ride, or if I crossed paths with something else entirely. All I know is that when I checked my back seat the next morning, the upholstery was damp with a smell like old gasoline, and I never saw either of their reflections in the mirror again, not once, after they climbed into my truck. That was the last story I can share tonight. Thinking back, what unsettles me isn't just the details, the empty buildings, the sudden silences, the strange things people say in the dark. It's how ordinary those moments felt while they were happening. They weren't marked by thunder or some sudden flash. They were quiet, steady, almost forgettable, except they stayed. Highways, motels, small towns, airports, they're not meant to be remarkable. They're the in-between places where you stop to fill up, to rest, to wait for something better. And yet those are the places that leave the strongest shadows. The wrong smile at a gas station counter, the 5th frame on a photo strip, the face that doesn't belong in the mirror. None of them should matter, but they do. I think the real horror lies in how easily we pass by these moments, never knowing which one might follow us home. That's why I tell these stories not to frighten, but to remember. Because once you've noticed how thin the line is between safe and strange, you can't quite look at these places the same way again. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If these stories have kept you company tonight, I hope you'll join me again for more nights like this. If you'd like to support the channel, please consider subscribing and sharing these stories with someone else who might listen in the dark. And tell me, have you ever passed through a place that seemed ordinary at first, but left you with a feeling you couldn't shake? I'd like to hear about it. For now, sleep well, and good night.